Does your mind ever venture into the strange space between our world and the other worlds? If you're interested in the things that dwell there, you're in the right place. I'm Kitty. Welcome to Fairy Encounters. Join me now for true fairy sightings and encounters spanning many years and occurring in many places. I've seen something that, as I understand it, could equate to a fairy. I was in the woods with a couple of friends having a beer. We literally had one beer each, and as we were standing there, this pinkish purple ball of light comes bouncing along through the air from the left to the right, but also towards us, like someone skipping towards you, you know? So it gets about 6 feet away from us, then stops dead still and hovers in the air for a moment. Then it shoots off into the woods at a right angle from its old path. Well, I've heard things like this called will-o'-the-wisps or fairy lights, but a friend whose family has lived in the area for generations told me that the denser parts of the forest here are filled with them, and they get people lost or lead people into sinkholes in the swampy areas. A young woman experienced a very strange encounter while staying at an old house in Gloucester in 1937. The house had a garden that attached to the forest of birdlip beeches, renowned for its strangeness. One day, after she had washed her hair, the young woman walked to a nice sunny spot out of sight of the house to let her hair dry as she sat and enjoyed the scenery. Suddenly, she felt an odd tugging in her hair. She turned to look and discovered a man, only 9 inches tall and dreadfully ugly and wrinkled, tangled up in her hair. His skin, she said, was the colour of dead leaves, and he complained in a high, squeaky voice that she had no right to be there as he struggled with her hair. The moment he freed himself from her hair, he disappeared. My friend and I were sitting on a riverbank, and we both noticed at the same time an amorphous, greyish shape on the ground about 100 yards ahead. We thought it may have been a large dog or even a deer. As we looked at it, it morphed into a branch and emerged again. It had become 2 female figures. They both had long flowing dresses on and something on their backs. They were joyful, and their laughter I could feel in my whole being. It was like, well, the best way I can describe it is like a babbling brook or rustling leaves. So I was living on the top floor of this house. It was remodelled into its own full separate apartment, and I often liked to smoke in my living room, which was a big square room with one massive bay window on one side, with a super tall pine tree right outside of the window. Well, I often watched the birds and the squirrels in this tree while I smoked, but one day I noticed that there were no squirrels, and even stranger, no birds at all. So I was sitting there mid-smoke when I watched this creature, this tiny humanoid creature, jump from one branch to another. It came from an upwards direction, so I'm assuming near the top of the tree. And this little guy was brown, Everything about him was brown. His skin, but his clothes too. And I know how weird it sounds, but he was wearing clothes. I couldn't tell what the materials were made from, but it definitely looked earthy and organic though. This little brown humanoid creature I was looking at wore what looked like a little brown cap on his head and some type of brown robe or dress looking thing covering his body. And it had bare feet, which were also brown. He couldn't have been more than 5 feet away from me. He was literally just outside my window. And I watched this guy jump from branch to branch, jump onto the branch that was eye level with me, walk along the length of the branch towards the trunk, hop and swing to grab the trunk and slide half a foot down to the next branch, then jump from branch to branch again until he hopped down and out of my view. All of this happened within no more than 3 or 4 minutes, and I just sat there for the longest time looking out the window, just hoping to see him again. I was absolutely shocked and mind-boggled. On a midsummer day in the year 1853, in County Donegal, Ireland, a boy named Neil Colton was out behind his home with his brother and a female cousin gathering berries, when the 3 of them heard music playing nearby. Stepping around some large rocks, the trio saw a group of 6 to 8 small people dancing in a circle only a few 100 feet away from them. As soon as they had spotted the dancers, a small woman dressed in red broke from that group and ran at speed at the children. She struck Colton's cousin across the face with what seemed to be a green rush. Not surprisingly, the children ran for the house, but as soon as they reached it, Colton's cousin fell down dead. Colton's father quickly fetched a priest who, reading psalms and striking the girl with his stole, managed to wake her from her death-like state. The priest told them that had she not grabbed hold of Colton when she was attacked, she would have been taken by the fairies forever. On May 18, 2022, I encountered fairies for the first time. I had been taking a walk with my friend down by a river trail on a blindingly beautiful, sunny and windy day. The trees were all around us, swaying and celebrating as we enjoyed our walk. It was the same path I'd been on many times before, but it felt so much more alive that day, and the wind felt so good on my face, and I remember it smelt of cloves. We reached an underpass bridge with cars going above our heads and across the river. We rested there for a bit, just taking in the magic of the space. The huge concrete pillars on the other side of the river were covered in ivy. It made the space look somehow sacred. I wondered how many people had walked or biked past that spot, not even noticing how ancient it seemed. Suddenly, from down the river, we saw a rippling sort of disturbance rapidly headed our way as a huge, spontaneous gust of wind hit us so hard it nearly knocked us both over. But the wind didn't feel biting or harsh, though. It felt warm and playful, and the water wasn't disturbed by this wind blast either. It didn't look choppy or violent. It looked as though a huge invisible bird had just skimmed the surface of the water, like whipping past us as a prank. Right then, in the distance, right by a fishing spot on the lake, we saw a column of dust kicked into the air in a vortex. My friend turned to me and said, "We need to get over there right now." She said it was some sort of sign for her. As we got to these little steps that led down by the river, we saw the steps were covered in this glittering silver silt that sort of sparkled like diamonds. I was sort of awestruck, but confused too, and I turned and looked at the river. And then I saw a phenomenon that I can't fully describe. It was fairies. They were fairies. They could only be. There were hundreds of them, little flashing lights playing and dancing and coming right up to me and then flying away again. They were of a colour that I'd never seen before, like a light so bright white that it was blue. All the scenery around me felt alive and more colourful than I had ever remembered as they danced. I don't know if I was there for 2 minutes or 20 minutes, but I watched them dance for me as though I were in a spell. I felt happy and like my every need was met in that moment. No other thoughts or worries were anywhere in my mind. Then, all at once, the space around me darkened back to the normal sort of vividness that I've always known, and the lights were gone, just gone, vanished. I remember a single crow flew over our heads and cawed once, and my friend said to me that that was our cue to go. So off we went, and I was still processing what had just happened. That day changed my life, and I have been enamoured with fairies since, to the point where I have changed the way I live. I have an old buddy from the army. We've stayed real close over the decades, and he has this ability to see things. He grew up in New Hampshire and has always said that there are plenty of things that live out in those woods that aren't just plants and animals. He's had more than one encounter with more than one thing, but the two things he believes were fairies were both related to trees. Now, some days my buddy would wake up early, before dawn, or be outside at twilight, and he would see a woman peeking out from behind the trees. He said he saw them, since it was more than one, every so often, and he'd always go and investigate but could find nothing, no tracks, no disturbance of any kind really around the trees. On other occasions, when he was living in a different house but in the same state, he said he'd be walking in the woods and that his earphones would be yanked off his head. This happened, he said, more than a dozen times, and every time it happened, he'd turn around and find that they were tangled in the tree branches above him, a full arm's length above him. Well, he tested out a few different theories. The wind, squirrels or raccoons, pulling on the branches to see how flexible they were, just to figure out how it could have happened, but nothing made sense. So eventually he asked whatever was doing it to kindly quit it, or he'd make them. Well, it seems whatever it was didn't listen, because it happened a couple more times, so Rather than follow through with his threat, he just stopped walking through that part of the woods. In 1948, Ed Reynolds was just 10 years old when he was visiting Horsham in England during a school summer holiday. One night, he went out under a bright moon to set rabbit traps, then waited nearby to see if he would catch anything. After a short while of waiting quietly, a 45-centimetre tall man covered in hair stepped out from a blackberry bush right near the boy. This odd visitor didn't seem to know that the boy was there, so Reynolds got a good look at the strange man. His face was bare and leathery with a sharp nose, he said, and his arms seemed to be longer compared to his body than a human's would be. Reynolds sat in silence watching, and after a short time, the odd man stepped back into the bush. The couple whom Reynolds was staying with laughed at him when he told them about seeing the little man. A few days later, Reynolds was riding on top of a double-decker bus through Horsham when he spotted the hairy little man walking boldly across a garden in the town. This time in broad daylight, and seemingly without a care in the world. About 10 years ago, there was a lunar eclipse, one of those blood moons, where the full moon shines blood red after the eclipse. It was July, I think. I had just come home late at night to my place in the beautiful hills of Northern California. My partner was tired and quickly retreated to bed, but I felt wide awake. I looked at the clock. It was midnight, and I remembered that there was a lunar eclipse happening at midnight that night, so I stepped outside and saw the glow of the moonlight behind the eclipse. I then noticed a soft white light dancing around the sky. It was twirling and making beautiful patterns in the darkness of the eclipse. I watched it for several minutes before I told myself, "You are crazy. You are not seeing this. Go to bed." As soon as I had this thought, the light darted towards a fir tree. It landed on a branch and began flashing every colour of the rainbow. It then flew straight up, still changing colours, and bits of colourful light were bursting from it as it flew. It then turned to a white light again, but in the shape of a pair of beautiful wings, the colour of moonlight. It hovered a while above the fir tree, then it flew up and then disappeared. I knew at that moment that fairies are real, and I felt honoured and blessed that a fairy wanted me to see it, and I spent the rest of that night outside under the light of that full moon. While travelling at night on a road that ran up some mountains, we saw a shapeless white form that appeared to be a white shopping bag blowing around in the wind, moving quickly up the mountainside. It was moving against the wind though, uphill. Well, we'd pulled off the road at a lay-by to look at the view of the city lights down below when we noticed the shape jumping from tree to tree towards us. It was about 2 or 3 square feet in area and a matte bluish white colour, like a large pillowcase or, like I said, a shopping bag. There were no markings or features. It wasn't shiny at all, and it looked more like a strange cloth than plastic. Well, both myself, I'm American, and my fiancé, who's Irish, had a feeling that whatever it was, its intentions were not good. We had a general sense that something unpleasant would happen if it caught up to us. So we jumped back in the car and hightailed it out of there. Mary Treadgold, a children's book author in England, was riding on a bus on the Isle of Mull on April 30, 1973, when the bus pulled to the side of the road to let an oncoming car pass by. As Treadgold looked across Pete to the side of the road, she noticed a young man with a shovel digging a hole near a patch of heather. Well, he caught her eye for two reasons. First, he was posed with a foot on the shovel, ready to drive it into the ground, yet he wasn't moving, as if frozen in position to try to be less noticeable. And second, he was only about 45 centimetres tall. He was wearing blue overalls and a white shirt, which, she said, almost seemed to glow, with the sleeves of it rolled up. He also had tight, curly brown hair and a sack on the ground next to him. Treadgold stared at the young man for about 10 seconds, long enough to confirm that she was looking at an actual living being and not a statue of some sort. It was then the bus started to roll away. Once Mary realised they were moving, she turned to look back but wasn't fast enough. The spot was lost to view and she never saw him again. I was walking home one night when a rustle began in a hedgerow to my right. Being from the country, I put it down to a badger or a fox out hunting. That thought soon fled when the rustling followed my every step. I increased my pace, but so did my unseen friend. I got really worried when, on encountering a gateway in the hedgerow, the rustling transferred to the other side of the road. By now I was petrified, but still pig-headed enough not to show it, and my unseen companion followed me for another half-mile. Then came the part I will never forget. The hedgerow rose above the road to about my shoulder height. It became sparse, thin, more like barbed wire than foliage. I turned my head sideways, and there, standing atop the hedgerow, blotting out the stars, was a shape about 3 feet tall. It was bulky at the waist and wide at the shoulders. If it was looking at me, I couldn't tell, but it stood for a few moments, as I did before I came to my senses and took off. I ran the last mile home. If it was following me, I couldn't tell, or I couldn't hear, for the blood was thrumming in my ears. When I reached my house, I collapsed in the door. My older brother was still up, and he saw the state of me. He still says to this day that my hair was standing on end. It was a hot August day in 1862, and David Evans and Evan Lewis were on their way back from Brecon, Wales, with a load of timber and headed to New Quay. They stopped for a rest and a drink overlooking a farm, and as they watched the reapers working in the fields, Evans spotted a line of 50 or so figures going up the side of a hill, about, he figured, 370 metres away. As Evans pointed out the group to Lewis, the first of the figures reached the top of the hill and started to dance. Soon all of the figures had reached the top and were dancing together in a large circle. As Evans and Lewis watched, the figures danced closer and closer to the centre of their circle in a spiral pattern. As each figure reached the centre of the circle, they disappeared into the ground. After all had vanished in this fashion, they reappeared the same way, one by one, and danced another round before vanishing back into the hill in the same manner. This time, however, they did not reappear. Evans and Lewis told the first person they ran into on the road, as it happened an old man, about what they had seen, and they asked him if he knew who the dancers could have been. He said he had no idea himself, but did mention that his grandfather saw fairies dancing on that hill. These incidents that happened to me happened at 2 different houses, both while we were living in the woods but on opposite sides of the country. The first was in Pennsylvania. We just moved into this house in the Blue Ridge Mountains, right at the top of the crest line. Nobody had lived in the house for a little while and the yard was a disaster, so I made it my mission to tidy it up over the course of the first few months. I had this old pair of tennis shoes that I'd been wearing for years that at this point I only wore for hiking in muddy areas and for yard work. Well, I had tied the bows in a double knot when I first got them and only ever slipped them on over my feet. Basically, these knots had been tied for years and they'd never come undone all the time that I'd been wearing them. Well, I think my first mistake was talking to the plants in the yard. I like to garden and I always feel sorry for plants when I have to hurt them. It sounds weird, I know, but I especially felt guilty for invading a yard full of plants that I didn't know. There was this overgrown hedge of rhododendron that had swallowed the front of the house. It was so dense you couldn't see through it, and it was covering the windows on the bottom floor, and I wanted to be able to see out of them. So I introduced myself to them, and I apologised that I was going to have to prune them so much, but I promised that I would try to do it in a way that would keep them healthy. I had to climb inside the hedge to get to the central part of the trunk with my handsaw and my loppers. After working for less than half an hour, I noticed that my shoes had come untied. I thought it was weird, but I just thought maybe all the sticks that I was stepping over had snagged the knots. So I retied them extra hard and went back to work. Another 30 minutes went by and it happened again. This kept happening over and over again for several days while I worked on that hedge. I don't know what was doing it, but I still have those shoes, and since finishing cutting that hedge, they have never come untied again. I saw a group of 6 she, 4 male and 2 female, walking through an open field beside a narrow footpath, coming in my direction. This wasn't my first contact with them, so I wasn't afraid. As we passed, we exchanged greetings in Irish and went each on our way, but the last of their company turned around when we were just a few steps past and asked me if I was Mary Burns' granddaughter. I said I was. She smiled and said Mary was with them and that I should visit with them sometime. I can't say that I never believed in fairies, but I'd never seen one until last year. I was out walking with a friend at dusk near the ocean in Oceanside, California. While we were walking and talking about life and struggles, suddenly, and out of nowhere from the sky, I was struck by what seemed to be a bird right at my waistline. Oddly, I didn't feel anything. I was simply witnessing this phenomenon unfold. Well, after the initial hit, this creature began spiraling around my leg. It was about 3 times while moving toward the ground. It then traced my foot 3 times before launching off my toe and then seemingly disappearing. I then saw what looked like a moth on the darkened ground before me, and so I shuffled my foot towards it. As I did this, the creature gently fluttered a bit before settling back to the ground. It freaked me out and sent chills down my back. My friend and I quickly walked back from where we'd come. I'd never seen anything like this before or after this event. And now it sort of haunts me to know that such creatures do actually exist, and I gladly welcome another encounter someday. To my amazement, I muddled some words to my friend, who had also gasped with amazement by what she had also seen happen. But before saying what I saw first, I asked her what she had witnessed, and she began telling me exactly what I had seen. It was in this moment I was truly flabbergasted by this fairy experience and couldn't help but wonder what it meant, if anything at all. I now know fairies exist, and with all we do not know about science and the quantum physics of multi-dimensional worlds and time travel, why is it so unbelievable? I wonder what else we have living all around us that we cannot see. In fact, I now question if fairy storybooks are really a history book of these little beings, rather than just children's bedtime stories. Every so often I phone my friend to verify that our crazy fairy experience really happened, and with no hesitation she validates the story without a doubt. I will say that I couldn't completely make out the creature because of its speed, but it was alive and intelligent for sure. This creature I saw that touched me, I've never seen or experienced anything like it in all my 47 years of life on this earth. One summer evening in 2005, John Franklin and his girlfriend were part of a group visiting a friend's house in Pennsylvania. The house was in a thickly wooded area, and they had all sat and watched the sunset from the back deck of the house. They continued to chat and hang out as the night grew darker and cooler, the deck lit by a single spotlight. Then they heard a noise in the potted plants near the spotlight, and everyone turned to look as something shot into the air from the pots. This creature was about 30 centimeters tall. It appeared to have a human head with long, pointy ears and something wrapped around its body. It paused for a moment in midair, just between the spotlight and the people. Then its wings opened, unwrapping from around the apparently female being's body. The wings were bat-like in that they appeared to be a membrane stretching from her fingers to her toes, and veins could be seen where the spotlight was shining through, but in overall shape the wings resembled that of a butterfly. The whole little being seemed to lightly glow with a greenish light. After hanging in space a moment more, the little being fluttered across the deck like a butterfly over the heads of the group and off into the dark woods. The only word that the group could agree to call this strange creature was, not surprisingly, fairy. In 1887, folklorist William Martin was taking his vacation on the Isle of Man when he met a mail cart driver who told him of an annoying experience that he had had in the summer of 1884. One evening, the mail cart driver said, he had set out on his rounds to collect bags of mail from the surrounding areas to bring back to the collection centre. After gathering the mail, the driver was on his way back and just 6 miles from the end of his trip when he encountered a troop of fairies dressed in red and carrying lanterns. The fairies stopped the cart's horse, threw the mail bags onto the road and started to dance around the bags. The mail cart driver, apparently a stubborn sort, proceeded to struggle to get the bags back on the cart. But as soon as he managed to place one back on the cart, the little fairy men in red would toss it out all over again. This kept on until daybreak, when the fairies finally left and the mail cart driver arrived at his destination hours late and irritated beyond belief. It happened about 11 years ago. I was 17 at the time and living in Finland. It was a little after midnight and it was winter, so the night was dark. I was living in an apartment and my room, which was on the 3rd floor, had a huge window. That night I was messaging a friend on Facebook when I heard what I thought was a moped driving by, so I just ignored it. I remember feeling this fear wash over me, and the feeling would not go away. I had actually had this feeling for a couple of days before the encounter. Then I heard the moped again, but this time I realised it wasn't a moped at all. It sounded like a man's voice, but not really human. The sound got closer and closer and sounded like it was saying, "Ah, ah, ah," like ghostly and chilling. I was still messaging my friend when the sound came strongly through my window, and at that moment I could see out of the corner of my eye there was a pale, faceless creature that appeared at my window. I turned to look at it and dropped my phone. I was too scared to pick it up and tell my friend, and too scared to stay in the room, so I ran out as quickly as I could and went across to my mother's room. She was mostly asleep when I told her that I'd seen something scary at my window, but I don't think it registered with her at all. I had other encounters with them, but this was the scariest, and I still have no idea what it was. But ever since that encounter, my bedroom curtains are always drawn, so I can't see what's outside. Among the Benarkey Hills in Scotland, fairies were to be found and their music was to be heard everywhere about Hill Park. They were always spoken of with respect by the inhabitants of the district. One day, 2 young ploughmen were on their way to the smithy when they came upon a group of fairies dancing and singing. Entranced at the sight, one of the young lads became transfixed and simply could not tear himself away. His companion, however, quickly left the scene assuming that his friend would follow on later. However, the transfixed ploughman failed to appear and was not seen again for an entire year and a day. On that day, his friend happened past the same place and was shocked to see his missing friend standing, mouth wide open, intently watching something. On being asked to come along home, he replied, as though he had only been there for a few minutes, that he would rather wait a little longer yet. I hope you've enjoyed this collection of true fairy encounters. If you'd like to support my channel, please consider becoming a patron. The link is in the notes below. But just giving me a thumbs up or telling a friend about my channel is really helpful too. Until next time, stay curious and be kind. Cheerio!